Okay, we're at 10 o'clock now, so good morning everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's expert panel discussion around how we can broaden the lens of integrated risk management to cover not only the risks of today, particularly during this challenging climate for businesses, but also looking ahead to the risks of tomorrow. My name is Mark Jackson. I'm the Practice Director for Turnkey's Integrated Risk Management Service Pillar. So therefore, I'm ultimately responsible for ensuring the portfolio of services that we provide to our clients within the area of IRM is meeting all of their requirements and needs, as well as ensuring that we're able to deliver these services and solutions in the most efficient and effective way possible. I'll be hosting and facilitating today's session, which I'm really excited about, as we'll be covering some very interesting and very relevant topics, which I hope you'll get some real value from. Of course, we'll be touching upon COVID-19 and the impacts that has brought into the world of IRM, as it's still very difficult to avoid that subject at the moment, and will be for a little while yet, it seems, although it certainly won't be dominating discussions. We'll also take a look at the Broaden report and how that might shape things in the not too distant future, the changing role of risk management professionals, and the role of technology as an enabler for IRM, to name but a few. In terms of the format of the session, we'll be conducting the panel discussion around these topics for approximately 30 minutes or so, and then we'll allow 10 to 15 minutes at the end for any questions that you might have. So please write down your questions into the chat window, into the Q&A part during the session itself, and I'll be monitoring that, and we'll step through those at the end. It'd be great to have as many questions as we can to make this as interactive as possible. In addition, for your information, we'll be recording the webinar, so it'll be made available to everyone on demand afterwards. If you're obviously not comfortable with that, then you can leave at this point. So, as this is a panel discussion, then obviously I won't be alone, and I'm pleased to be joined by three of our experts from Turnkey's newly formed IRM SME external network. Now, the purpose of this network is to expand our IRM knowledge, our knowledge base and thought leadership by tapping into those risk practitioners that are out there actually doing the stuff that we're theorising about. It gives us a great opportunity to gain invaluable insights from their experience and knowledge, helping us to tailor our services accordingly so that they can become even more relevant for the challenges that our clients are facing today and will likely face tomorrow. The SME network is also critical in helping us to develop content that is industry focused so that our solutions can be more targeted and relevant, and with industry-specific accelerators wrapped around them. So let me introduce our three guests today. Firstly, we have Zoe Williams, who started her career in accountancy, then realised that internal audit and risk were her calling. Zoe has led several internal audit and risk functions for FTSE-listed companies. She retrained in 2017 as an executive coach, and now through her consultancy, Luminary Mindset Consulting, help CEOs and executives of global organisations link their culture and behaviour to their strategic outcomes through risk management. So welcome, Zoe. Next, we have Stefan Gasheta. Stefan started his career in risk in the Royal Navy over 20 years ago, with highlights including training leadership teams of warships and in Afghanistan and Iraq on risk governance and decision making. He created and taught on the Defence MBA in risk and operational planning. Leaving the Royal Navy in 2012, he has had senior risk roles in the US, Switzerland and the UK, latterly as head of risk at Johnson Matthey and now of the Crown Estate. He has extensive experience in governance, risk controls and assurance, and is an expert in automation, data and advanced analytics. So welcome, Stefan. And last but certainly not least, we have Paul Thomas. Paul has over 20 years of experience working in IT and business risk management, compliance and internal audit in practice and for large multinational organisations in the UK, US, Middle East and the Caribbean. His focus is now on helping companies understand how they can utilise leading technologies in GRC, data analytics, robotics, data mining, etc., to support the digitisation of risk management and compliance, thereby improving the effectiveness of their control environments and ability to respond quickly to any emerging risks or issues. So welcome, Paul. I'm going to stop sharing my slides now so we have the full video. Okay. Thanks so much for joining us today, guys. I'm sure with the very rich and varied backgrounds between you all, then we'll have some really interesting discussions with some potentially varied insights and different angles being covered. So let's get straight into the discussion at this point and start off by approaching the unavoidable topic of the pandemic. Now, specifically, I'd be interested to know from what you've seen and experienced, which risk domains have been brought more sharply into focus as a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic. don't know who wants to kick us off on this one.
Happy to kick us off on this one, because there's a bit of an overlap between my old career and new career. So obviously one of the risks, it's not a new risk, but it's one that's certainly more on the top table radar at the moment, is people. Resilience, well-being. We know that we've got a rise in people risk, and certainly with people being furloughed, taken out of the work environment and then brought back in, and what that's doing to the cultural risk of the organisation, and then the overall performance is something that I've noticed certainly over the last 6 months, is something that's more prominent with the people that I'm talking to.
Sure. And Paul, Stefan, any insights from yourselves on that?
Yeah, I like it. So there's some good points there, Zoe. So the thing for me is, I think most corporates had recognised the concept of a pandemic in their risk registers, but they'd always seen it as maybe a local, maybe in a particular region. So I think the global nature has caught people out. I think what you say, Zoe, around the people agenda, all that, absolutely, you know, not only how do they protect their people, it's not just in the workplace, but even when they're travelling to work, or, you know, on trains, you know, coming up to London. Certainly me as an individual that worked in London, that the biggest concern was for me was being stuck in a metal can for 50 minutes with maybe 3 or 4 different people that had COVID amongst 100 or so. But also the other risk that I sort of can refer to is things around supply chain, you know, being able to get the goods from China on time, even literally things by being able to transport goods across borders when countries have closed their borders. I mean, we're all aware of how hard it was to get fresh eggs by the end of March. It took a couple of months. So yeah, the people thing, but also the supply chain for me, I think, is another risk domain that's quite important. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Stefan, for that.
Yeah, the challenge was encapsulated by a tension between those sectors which were seeing their markets shrink, and in some cases even collapse. If you take automotive as an example, where automotive manufacturers, and this will apply to sectors like transport, oil and gas, clearly when we saw the price of crude turn negative in some for some brief crazy days. So in those instances, it was a question of how quickly you could turn the taps off. And then you had the conflicting and arguably equally challenging but opposite end of the spectrum issues in those industries where actually the taps were being turned on. So FMCG, for example, and definitely in terms of healthcare, medicines and medical devices, you saw that tension where actually there were the challenge was the agility to be able to react to very rapidly changing market environments. The issue was that although, as Paul mentioned, you know, a lot of people had foreseen or at least discussed the pandemic, I think there were 2 key issues. One was the severity. Nobody had really stress tested their organizations to the extent that they needed to, and the other was really the variety of impacts, and I think we've touched on those already. But people impact for sure, cultural, yes. It's also interesting, I think there are some clear winners and losers in terms of reputational risk. So some sectors and some businesses within those sectors have come out looking very, very good. Others have arguably fared less well. And I think it's been very interesting, those who've had an effective crisis management response and those perhaps who've been a little bit more wanting.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the stress testing concept there, because my next question was going to be in that, you know, what ways do you see that risk management processes are being sort of almost stretched to the limit and tested and challenged throughout this unprecedented event? Where are those sort of key areas where you think it is, you know, it's close to bursting point as such?
I think that varies depending again on the sector and on the specific business. I think in terms of risk management as a discipline, as a function, I think businesses which are still looking at their risks in quite a linear fashion and coming up with a list of things that might happen, and arguably fairly static risk registers that might get updated once or twice a year. I suggest that those businesses are going to find not just the pandemic, but also the recovery period more challenging. I think businesses who are able to do that a little bit more dynamically, regular updates to those risks, but also controls on how effective they're functioning. And I think increasingly causal analysis is going to become, or has already become, much more relevant. So understanding once a risk has occurred and that's trickling through your organization, the various touch points, what will be affected, the different functions, different divisions within the business, and how that risk travels through the business and affects your corporate outcomes, will become increasingly a source of competitive advantage, because you'll be able to respond much more effectively to complex risks such as those that we've seen.
Okay. Zoe, Paul, have you seen any other ways in which risk management approach have been stretched to the limit?
Well, I was going to put a bit more of a positive spin on it, if I may, because I know there is obviously the stretch to the limit has happened, but also the organisations that I worked with pre-COVID they were always trying to figure out ways to stress test their risk management framework, that was in line with board risk appetite, and it wasn't, but when you're working in, for example, supply chain, where there's heavy dependency on supply chain, and you really want to try and stress test your risk management framework, it's quite difficult to create the scenario. You've got to role play and whatnot. So the clients that I've been speaking to recently have said to me, wow, this has provided us with a huge opportunity to really figure out what our control framework looks like in a crisis, to really figure out what our capabilities are, and to really see how our people perform when we need agility and when we need flexibility. So there's been a lot of opportunity around. I think a lot of leaders have been surprised at how agile their organization actually has turned out to be, how flexible people can be, and how well they can adapt in the face of a crisis. Yes, we've got that recovery piece to go through now, which is going to be a completely different way of being rather than the crisis management piece. But I think this has been a really good learning curve in a positive way for a lot of organizations. Just on Paul's point as well around supply chain, I know specifically in England, a lot of organisations were already stress testing their supply chain because of Brexit, right? There's been a couple of years where that's been hot on the risk register, risk registers of most organisations that are heavily reliant on that anyway. So again, there's been a kind of a run up to this that it's not been as unexpected as everyone has almost made out it to be. There has been planning and preparation put in place before this happening, and I think it's been quite a pleasant surprise for some people in terms of how well their risk management framework is held up.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's important that we recognise the positive sides of things as well. Sorry, Paul.
Yeah, no, just to add, I mean, I think, Steph made a really good point. I mean, most companies traditionally have looked at risk management, oh, well, let's do it every 6 months. They've had to respond and, looking at it more on a monthly basis as the whole thing evolved, how do they initially respond to COVID and this concept around what's the new normal going to look like? People aren't going to go back to work again in the office 5 days a week, so things are going to change anyway. But the other thing is the positivity of it. So a couple of things for me is, whilst it's not directly to risk management, it just shows how when people are challenged, they can really collaborate. So this concept around building the ventilators, the Formula One team stopping building cars, building the way they could go from nothing to actually have a fully working prototype within a month, I thought that was amazing. Similarly, the stuff now about it takes years to get a vaccine approved all the way through clinical trials and approved by the regulators. I think I was looking at an article from a professor in Oxford that's been involved in the AstraZeneca, and she talks about, normally it's 6, 7, 8, 10 years to get the thing, but they're managing to do it now in 10 months. That just shows when people are challenged, one of the positive things, people pull together supply chain, creation of a vaccine, that type of stuff. So there's a lot of positives, as both Zoe and Stefan have mentioned, but I'd like to call that out because there are some good things that have come out of it. Not that many, but there are some.
It's a bit about that personal resilience almost.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So moving away slightly from the pandemic now and onto something which is on also a lot of people's minds due to it looming on the horizon, which is the Broaden report, which advocates building on the existing concept of professional skepticism so that audits can help deliver greater and more deserved confidence regarding a company's financial health and performance. It's been coined by some as the potential to turn into the UK's version of Sarbanes-Oxley, and we're all aware of the extra challenges such regulatory requirements bring. So in your view, what will likely be the impact of the Broaden report, taking into account all aspects of its reach, including fraud, sustainability, cybersecurity, etc.?
So maybe I can quickly talk to that. So I think because of recent accounting, call it scandals, Carillion, BHS, Broaden, I think it's Donald Broaden was asked to look into that. He's come up with quite a lot of recommendations about how the external audit can be moved on, not just to something around the financial statements. He talks about the concept of a UK light version of SOX. He talks about other assurance, much formal reporting around things such as cybersecurity, EHS agenda, etc., more formalized fraud. So he's asking for more risks to be identified and reported on. Now, similarly to that, the FRC in the UK is the body that's going to enable all of the Broaden recommendations. Last month, they issued their consultation paper, where they themselves recognise that the concept of just an annual paper-based report going forward isn't fit for purpose. So they themselves talk about, they haven't explicitly referred SOX, but they talk about much more comprehensive reporting around controls, around fraud. But they also talk about much more about the use of technology and challenging companies to disseminate more information about how they're performing, how they're adding value, not just to shareholders and employees, but also to society as well. So there's a whole challenge there that's being worked through the system. But I think ultimately we'll end up with a lot more reporting as part of the audit process. And there's a real play in terms of how technology can enable that, both in terms of maybe key risk indicators the companies need to report on, but how they use technology itself to manage controls, but also report their results on more than potentially just on an annual basis. I think that there's a lot of stuff in there, but it's still working its through. But I can see some of the recommendations probably start to take effect maybe towards the end of next year. So the clock's ticking on it. I still think there's some discussions going on there.
This is a fascinating one for me, if I may, because from all my years in audit, I recognised that there was a lot of behavioural risk within an organisation, and fraud and misappropriation of assets. If you're going to commit fraud, it tells me that there's a behaviour that's obviously going on before anything else. So it's going to be an interesting one to have audit be requested to this professional suspicion. And how are they going to then report that? To your point, Paul, they're going to have to rely on more on KPIs and data, because it can't be judgmental, it can't be opinion. But at the same time, when you're effectively auditing a behaviour that is out of line with internal controls and code of conduct, there's that fine line, isn't there, between judgment, opinion and fact and actuals that they're going to find themselves butting up against. So I'll be interested to see how the training for this is rolled out, if this does become a reality in the future.
Okay, thanks for that, guys. Let's move into the area or concept of integrated risk management next. Now, before we discuss this topic further, I realise that this term has different meanings to different people. So let me start by providing you with Turnkey's definition of IRM. So we see it as an approach that organisations can take to govern all risks encountered as part of running a business, and in a way that enables senior management to make risk intelligent decisions to help drive better business performance. So in a nutshell, helps to replace those potentially fiction-based assumptions into fact-based assertions, which are supported by surfacing the right level of risk information up through an organisation. This information is traditionally retained, I guess, and managed in silos. And so IRM identifies those, or the concept around IRM identifies those key relationships between those different risk domains, i.e. what we refer to as the golden thread, so that where those relationships exist, that changes in risk within one domain can inform risks in another, particularly when they work their way up to impacting strategic objectives at the enterprise risk level. So with that in mind, why do you think that IRM is becoming more important than ever, and how difficult do you think it is to obtain?
I think that integrated risk management, and I like your definition. Actually, I think we're all agreed here around the importance of risk in terms of meeting objectives. I think that risk gained relevance and prominence over the last 2 decades. I suspect perhaps a little less than that. And there was an initial flush of interest following various analyses on UK corporate governance. But I think integrated risk management, in the way that you've defined it, and it tallies nicely with the Broaden report, is really an attempt to try and make it much less of a black box and an industry unto itself, and more relevant to the business as a whole. And I think there's a few things to bear in mind around that. The first of which I would offer is relationships. I think risk has always had a funny relationship with the rest of the business, and I don't actually think it's that helpful that it's always paired, or almost always paired, with audit and assurance or compliance. I think integrated risk management provides an opportunity, and in fact it is dependent on good relationships with other parts of the business, not least treasury, but also strategy, where are we going, operations, how are we doing today, and deeply embedded in things like the company secretary's world and governance. So I think integrated risk management is around understanding the target, the value that we're seeking to create, not just the value that we're seeking to protect, and then putting the risks in the context of that value and taking decisions around those risks. It sounds obvious when you talk about it in these contexts, but actually people find it very hard to get away from, I just want to talk about my top 10 risks. Well, why 10? And it might only be 3, you might be making life hard for yourself, but actually the context, that relationship with strategy and that relationship with treasury and operations, I think that's a real opportunity, and where IRM can really genuinely provide some value or significant value to a business who does it properly.
And have any of you seen, obviously people, it's a bit of a journey, and so people will be on that journey, but there's various different levels of maturity of RM. If what are those different varying levels that you've seen within some of your organisations that you've worked with, and and also touch upon, like mentioned before, that those particular challenges in moving upwards in that maturity curve?
I can give a good example. The last organisation where I headed up the audit and risk function, and Stefan, I do agree with you, it was quite a challenge heading up audit and risk at the same time, because I did have to take one hat off and put one hat on, and of course I was always wearing half a hat each time I was having a different conversation, so it is a challenge. But at Howdens, they had an incredibly mature integrated risk management. I don't even want to call it a system, it was a culture, it was a risk culture. Now, from my experience, when material risks crystallize, it's rarely to do with a system or a procedural breakdown. It's normally to do with somebody doing something that they shouldn't have done, because we find that systems and processes are way more robust than the people that are interacting with them. So what they did at Howdens was they made sure that risk management wasn't part of the risk function. So we had a risk function, but it was actually embedded in the business as usual. It was embedded as part of the culture, so that every single day, every decision that everyone was making on the ground, bottom up, was with the mind that there was some level of risk that they were either taking or not, and were they empowered to make that decision? Yes. And therefore, what did the risk team do? Well, we just had 1,000 conversations, so we just made sure that we were moving around the business, bringing subject matter expertise and bringing that sounding board and that ear, so that we did have the right data and the right reporting back up to the board, but at the same time we also would provide reinforcing that risk culture. So it was very decentralized and very locally managed, and people were empowered to make those risk management decisions themselves, which really worked very effectively.
So how did that culture come about? I mean, because there are, I would say, the majority, with a few years in consulting and then several years kind of doing it on the client side, in that context, I've seen a distribution, a wide distribution of abilities and approaches, but I think what you've just described sounds like Valhalla, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. How did it come about, and how long did it take?
So the founder, the CEO at the time when I was there was the founder, and he'd founded the organization 25 years previously, and there were only 11 people originally that set the company up, and those
Right.
11 people were still within the organization. And their recruiting policy, when I joined, they had 9,000 employees and over 600 depots, but their recruiting policy was focused on culture and hiring people that were aligned with the culture above and beyond any other skill set that they were looking for. So culture was their number one risk on their risk register. And that was the mantra and the drumbeat, and the heart of the organization was culture, behavior, and part of that was their risk culture and how they managed risk. So they really knew from day one that the culture was going to be the make or break of the organization, and everything else then just works around that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I'd add, I mean, the more mature organizations for me, the ones that understand they don't look at risks in isolation, they look at how they correlate with one another. You know, and they can actually say, well, if this risk happens here in the supply chain, that's going to affect my people risk over there. And that for me is the main difference between an immature and a mature organization in terms of how they look at risks in totality and recognize it's a dynamic environment. Yeah.
Yes.
And what you talk about in Howden, I mean, as Stephanie alluded to, it sounds as if I'm not sure whether I'd use the word Valhalla, but it sounds as if you've had a very mature setup there, which I think most corporates haven't yet achieved, but certainly do aspire to.
They do aspire to it, and it's that golden thread that Mark spoke about. It's the golden thread from culture and behavior and people and the processes and systems all the way through the decision making and out the other side to the strategic outcomes, which I know, Stefan, you and I could talk for hours about this, couldn't we? And there's that missing link. Often organizations, they look at their risk system and then they look at their outcomes, but they don't take a step back and look at, okay, how is this linking in with the people and the culture side of things? Because that's actually where the risk is being affected. That's the decision making. That's where it's actually happening.
I think there's also an argument to look at it in a good old-fashioned maturity framework context. So
yeah.
If you look at risk in its purest form, a lot of people will see risk synonymous with threat, and to an extent, at its most basic level, you know, what you're doing by managing risk effectively is keeping us out of trouble. So at its most basic level, you've got to be asking, all right, I'm probably reactive, I'm probably not predicting because, you know, I don't have that maturity yet, but actually, have I got my arms around the risks which are going to affect my license to operate, for example? So you know, I think maturity has to start there, and you have to have brilliant basics in place to be able to deal with those risks which are going to affect your ability to stay solvent. I think from there it becomes more predictive and also more about value creation rather than value protection. But I think that is harder, and I think as you move from firefighting, and to use Boris's possibly ill-advised phrase, playing whack-a-mole with risks. I think we've all been there. I've certainly seen a lot of organisations who are still in whack-a-mole mode. But once you're embedding, and once you are using risk as a lever to take better decisions, I think what you can build towards is this organisation that is risk aware, but using risk to take better decisions. And I've got an example from my previous company where there was quite detailed technical design going on for a factory, and they were under a lot of pressure in terms of time to get this thing designed and built. We managed to persuade them to dwell a pause of 2 weeks and have a fire break, review all the risks. My challenge to them was not, are you sure these are the risks which we need to be worrying about? I was comfortable that we had those license to operate risks controlled. Instead, the challenge was, where can we take more risk, but do it knowingly? So where are we overspending on potential controls? Because there's always a temptation to over-engineer. Where are we being a bit too risk averse, and where can we lift the pressure off a little bit? that was a really interesting exercise, because not only did they identify a lot of controls that actually they felt they didn't need, and that helped in terms of project costs and control, but actually they took a key decision which was seen as a bit more risky, because they decided to employ a bit more technology, de-risk that by taking a bit more time over it. So they were going to be slightly later to market, but actually they were going to be 30% more efficient once they were online. I got significant criticism at the time for asking for them to delay and review. And I'd love to say that they came back and slapped me on the back and said, that was a really good steer that you gave us. Actually, 2 people did, but the majority just kind of ignored it. But actually it worked. Two weeks of analysis of where actually more risk could be taken knowingly was an example of using risk to take better business decisions. Yeah, I think it's difficult, but it's achievable.
Well, there's some really interesting insights and illustrations of how RM is being applied in some of the organisations that you work with. We do have a question that's come through in the Q&A chat. Just before we go on to that question, just to finish off this kind of the RM topic as such, and it's an extension to the question that we've just been discussing. But how important do you see the role that technology can or should play as an enabler for progressing organisations along that RM maturity curve?
Shall I start? I think there are three key positive effects that technology can bring, as long as you're also aware of the additional challenges that using technology solutions can imply. 3 areas of technology that I'd focus on would be automation in the first instance. So here I'm looking at things like data gathering, data assimilation, aggregation. So pulling in sources, many sources into a single data environment that mean that data is at least in the same place to start analysis. I think in the same context, technologies like RPA, robot process automation, are very effective at pre-formatting. So a significant chunk of data expenditure goes on formatting, and I think automation can help with that. The next layer is analysis itself. So here, what I'm not talking about is dashboarding. I'd put that under reporting, which is the third area that I think is useful. When I'm talking about analysis, what I mean is things like spotting patterns, spotting complex patterns around that data that you've brought in. Oh, and by the way, data can still be expert opinion. So if you're sat here thinking, data isn't for me, I need this all singing, all dancing data environment, and I need to basically be Google before I can get that. That's not the case. Data can still be, what do you think about this risk? Could you circle some scores for me and show? Yes, it's basic. It's sort of step 2 or 3 on the maturity curve, but it's still data that you can analyze more effectively than just using Excel. Anomaly detection is another thing that I think is really useful in terms of risk analysis, spotting when something's different from before out of those thousands of data points that you can pull in. And then finally, reporting. Your front end's got to be beautiful. I think there's a way of making that risk information more digestible, more palatable, and more easily absorbed and understood. But before you get to any of those 3 layers, which are automation, analysis, and reporting, I think it all starts with the question set that you want answered. Being clear about what questions you want to ask or what questions you want to have answered is, for me, the start of any successful data project, whether in the risk domain or without. And you'll find that stakeholder engagement is made much easier as a result of agreeing which questions that you want to explore.
Thanks, Stefan. We'll just move on to the, we've got a couple of questions that have cropped up now. So The first one is, what are your thoughts around accepted and tolerated risks?
Might need a bit more context.
Good question.
I'll repeat it again. What are your thoughts around accepted and tolerated risks? I guess it's around the concept of accepting and tolerating risks.
I think that speaks to what Stefan said around how risk management can often be seen as something where we're just managing every, you know, we're potentially controlling things too much, and actually accepted and tolerated risks are always where, for me, in my experience, it's where there's been an opportunity or there's been quite a lot of value to be extracted. So accepted and tolerated risks, as long as everyone at, you know, all levels, especially the board where it's set, are in line with what the objective is and what the perceived value is that we're trying to go for, then I'm all for them. I think they're, for me, when I was leading risk functions, that was always the kind of the more exciting conversations where we're talking about, okay, we're going to accept a little bit more risk here and we're going to see what happens. Yes, let's go for it. And trials and tests and controlling it in, you know, large organizations, you don't want to just wholesale roll out an accepted and tolerated risk, but I think they're great. Innovative.
I think as long as it's done consciously, as long as you are accepting. I don't actually like the term acceptance. I think you have to accept all risks that you've identified. You might accept them and then decide to do something more about them. But I think tolerate is a useful word. I think it's useful in the context of the 4Ts, which I don't know if that's universally understood, but 4Ts are basically the strategies that you can take to manage risk. So the first is treat, which is capex or opex. So we're putting controls in place to reduce the likelihood of the risk or reduce an impact. And then the next is transfer. So we're transferring risk impact out of the organization. So that could be insurance or giving it to a third party. I think once you get to tolerate, what you've got to do is look really carefully at your treatment. Where has that taken me towards my appetite? Transfer, there's a residual that I've now transferred out. That means that my risk has been reduced to a level that I can estimate. Tolerate, I think then you've got to consciously go, right, the leftover risk after my treatment and after my transfer means I could have an impact on my P&L of X or on my balance sheet of Y. That's what tolerate means for me. But you can't just say, yeah, I nearly did a swear there. Yeah, sod it. We'll tolerate it. Tolerate means we have an estimate. We have evidence to suggest that the impact of this risk will be £1 million. So that you know, should that risk still come to pass, the size of the problem that you're left with. I don't know. It would be great to be able to talk to the questioner, because I don't know if that's even vaguely close to what they were talking about. But that's what tolerating a risk means to me. I hope that's useful.
Just in case anybody's wondering what the 4th T is, Stefan, because you didn't say it's terminate, isn't it?
Terminate, yeah. Pack it in. Yeah, which sorry, no, what a team. That's great.
So we're on the cliffhanger there.
I've got you.
Next question. Do you use a specific framework for IRM, or is it a mixture, or does every company have something that fits its goals?
Well, again, from my experience, every company's had its different way of doing this. I mean, there's obviously your off-the-shelf systems, and then you've got your consulting firms that come in and design certain bespoke systems or processes, but everybody's doing it differently from my experience. I don't know about Stefan and Paul, what you think?
I think I agree with that. Every company seems to do it differently.
Yeah.
I mean, even, you know, when you look at the underlying technologies around risk management, so things like SAP's offering, that's still in its infancy, and it, you know, certainly from my experience, it's very difficult at the moment to configure the systems to meet the requirements of individual companies because they're so different. So yeah, there is no one size fits all from my point of view. The most important thing is the companies decide on what they're going to do and just follow through on it and just make a risk management process system that works effectively for them, because it might be different across different companies, different geographies, etc., etc.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing more and more of an argument for organisations employing more than one technology solution to support the wider IRM strategy, because it's typically, like you say, there's not really that holy grail of one technology solution fits all requirements. it's taking the strengths of different ones and bringing them together to sort of achieve all of those goals and objectives.
Yeah, so there are quite a lot, as you say, Mike, quite a lot of point solutions, but you can still get a very powerful system when you weave them all together, because they've got strengths in their own right, but there is no one overall system from a technology point of view that fits all. I think things will change. I think there's a lot of rapid movement at this moment in time. It is very much around the individual point solutions and how you weave those together. And I know Stefan referred to earlier about how you use the data to give a holistic, real-time view of how you are in terms of managing risk.
Okay, we've got another
dimensions that sorry,
Stefan, go on.
In terms of frameworks, I think there are 4 dimensions that I would always consider. So I'd start off with the objectives and the outcomes. So that's your key. Get an appointment in the diary with the chief operating officer, the chief strategy officer, and treasury, and really get into their heads and understand where the company is going on a day-to-day basis, so operationally, but also where are we planning to be in 6, 12, 18 months time and beyond, because that's your context for IRM. That's why you're here. If you're coming up with risks that aren't germane to any of those, then arguably they're probably still interesting, but are they important? And that's the question that you need to answer for yourself. The second dimension is external risks. So external risks you can classify as risks that you can't prevent. You're not going to be able to stop these things happening. We're talking, I don't know if you're familiar with PESTLE, that's an example of an external risk approach. So politics, economic, sociology, that kind of stuff, environmental. So stuff that's coming from the outside that's going to affect you in. All you can do is be agile in the face of that change. So that's external risk. The third dimension is internal risk, so stuff that I can prevent. So if I invest CapEx or OpEx, or I can buy an insurance policy and affect that risk, then that's an internal risk. So we're reacting now to the stuff coming in from the outside. I think the final dimension, and arguably the most interesting, the most challenging, is to separate risk from uncertainty. So the final dimension is uncertainty. So where do we think we might have risk, or we should have risk, or our peers have risk, but we haven't been able to identify anything? Is it because we're too close to the problem and we can't see them? Is it because, or rather, we're too close to the problem and we just manage these risks day to day? Is it because we know about the risks, but we're just not talking about them? Well, that's kind of more worrying. Or finally, we literally, it's a vacuum. We don't know if there's a risk there or not, which is possibly the most concerning state.
Okay. Sorry, Stefan, I'm just conscious of time, because we've got a couple of minutes to go and we've got 2 more questions to get through. So these ones are going to have to be snappy. So how can you convince the board about the value of enterprise risk management, and how can you influence change the culture? Probably not a snappy type of a response to this one. But
I can snappy response that one. Don't try and convince them, show them, and you've got to understand their needs. Like listen before you tell, and listen before you try and convince anybody of anything. So if you don't understand the board's needs, you can't show them what it is that they want and the value that they're seeking to get out of the ERM framework, and how to influence the culture, become the culture.
Yeah, very sensible.
I agree with that. And don't talk about risk, talk about objectives. The board are not interested in risk. What they're interested in is meeting their scorecard. So find out what's on their scorecard, what are the objectives, and then talk about those. The risks will follow.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo that. I mean, you have to talk to these board members about objectives, and you can't be telling them what to do, so you have to sort of weave it into the conversation. And then you can talk about risk at the end. But if you turn around and say, I want to have a meeting to discuss risk and things like that, it's going to take you months to get to meet them.
Okay, and finally, how is risk appetite managed, i.e. from a top-down approach?
How is it managed?
Again, at the risk of sounding repetitive, and I don't know if you're getting your money's worth here, Mark, or not, risk appetite isn't, what you shouldn't be talking about is risk. What you actually are talking about is outcomes appetite. What appetite do we have for this thing, this event, this product launch, going into new geography, making an acquisition, restructuring, whatever it happens to be, the big corporate muscle move. what is the appetite for that thing, and then the appetite for the risks follow that. So if you have one corporate objective which is placed at higher priority than another, you are naturally going to have a higher risk appetite for those risks than for these ones. Once you've got them underway, it's all about the controls. It's all about what you're doing to reduce that risk towards appetite.
Okay, great. Hopefully you should, I've shared my screen again. Hopefully you guys can see it now. Okay. Yeah, so that was a good one to finish off on. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of our session, unfortunately. So thank you once again to Zoe, Stefan and Paul for providing your own thoughts and perspectives around the topics that we've covered. There's some really interesting insights, so thank you for that. Also, thank you to those of you that have joined us today. I hope you also found it valuable and it touched upon some areas of interest and hopefully addressed some challenges that you're currently wrestling with and helped to provide a bit more clarity from that perspective. As I mentioned at the top of the webinar, it will be available on demand and it should be available very soon, so you can revisit some specific areas of interest at your leisure. And also please share this content with any colleagues you feel may benefit from it as well. If you have any questions about any of the topics raised today and would like the opportunity to have a one-to-one discussion, then please contact me and I'll be happily set something up. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and we'll see you again soon. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.